You never thought a single piece of clothing could unravel the entire fabric of who you believed yourself to be. You never thought that something as simple as satin, laces, and boning stitched into a curved shape could reach inside your chest, grip your heartbeat, and rearrange every certainty you had ever carried about yourself. But that is exactly what happened the night your wife pulled the corset out of the bottom drawer of her wardrobe, held it up in the amber light of the bedroom lamp, and said with a soft, unreadable smile, "Tonight it is your turn." You had been married to Elena for 6 years. 6 years of ordinary mornings, ordinary arguments, ordinary tenderness. She was the kind of woman who noticed things. She noticed when you lingered a second too long looking at the mannequins in the department store windows. She noticed when your eyes drifted toward the silk scarves at the market. She noticed when you touched the hem of her nightgown one evening and pulled your hand back as if the fabric had burned you. She noticed everything, and she never said a word, not for years. Not until that particular Friday night when the rain was tapping against the window like a patient visitor and the whole house smelled of the lavender candle she always lit when something important was about to happen. You had come home late from work, exhausted, your tie loose, your collar damp from the rain. You expected dinner, small talk, maybe a film on the sofa. What you did not expect was to find the bedroom door slightly open, warm light spilling into the hallway, and Elena sitting on the edge of the bed with something folded in her lap. Something the color of dark wine. Something with ribbons trailing down to the carpet. Something that made your throat tighten before your mind could even name what you were seeing. She looked up at you and said your name in that particular voice she used when she wanted the truth and nothing else. She said, "Come here." Just that. Come here. You crossed the room slowly, and every step felt heavier than the last, as if the floorboards themselves were pulling you down. When you stood in front of her, she lifted the corset and held it out to you. The garment was beautiful in a way that felt almost cruel, the kind of beautiful that dares you to touch it. Deep burgundy satin, black lace along the edges, silver hooks running down the front, and long silk ribbons at the back that reminded you of the ropes on old sailing ships, the kind that hold entire masts upright against the wind. She said, "I have known for a long time." And you did not have to ask what she meant. You wanted to speak. You wanted to laugh it off. You wanted to say something that would make the room ordinary again, something that would put the corset back into the drawer and put you back into the man you had spent your whole life pretending to be. But your mouth opened and no words came out, because the truth was that you had known too. You had known for years. You had known since you were 14, and you tried on your cousin's blouse in the guest room and stared at yourself in the mirror for what felt like hours, feeling something warm and terrifying rise inside your chest. You had known since you were 20, and you bought a pair of stockings from a shop 3 towns away and hid them in a shoebox under your bed. You had known since your wedding day, when you looked at Elena in her white gown and felt not only love but something else, something quieter, something that whispered, "You want to know what that feels like, don't you?" Elena stood up. She placed the corset gently on the bed, smoothing it with her palm as if it were a living thing that needed calming. Then she looked at you and said, "Tonight we are not going to hide anymore. Not you. Not me. Not this." Your knees felt strange. Not weak exactly, but uncertain, as if they were not sure whose knees they were. You asked her, in a voice so small you barely recognized it, "What do you want me to do?" And she smiled, and the smile was not mocking. It was not triumphant. It was tender, the way you smile at a child who is about to take their first steps. She said, "I want you to let me dress you." The words landed somewhere deep, deeper than words usually go. You felt your breath catch. You felt a heat rise up your neck. You felt tears push against the back of your eyes for reasons you could not explain. Because this was not a fantasy anymore. This was not a stolen moment in a locked bathroom. This was your wife, the woman who knew you better than anyone, standing in front of you and offering you a doorway you had spent your entire life pretending did not exist. You nodded. You could not speak. You just nodded. She began with your shirt. She undid the buttons one by one, slowly, the way someone unwraps a gift they have waited a long time to give. Her fingers were warm. She peeled the shirt from your shoulders and let it fall to the floor. Then she reached for the belt at your waist and paused, looking up at you, waiting for permission. You gave it with your eyes. She unbuckled the belt, and it made a soft metallic sound as it slid free, and that sound felt like the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. When you were standing in only your undergarments, feeling more exposed than you had ever felt in your life, she picked up the corset. She held it in front of you and said, "Arms up." You raised your arms. She slipped the corset over your torso, and the satin was cool against your skin, cool and smooth and alive, and you felt yourself gasp softly, though whether from the cold or from something else you could not say. She turned you around to face the tall mirror on the wardrobe door. And there you were, a version of you that you had never seen before. The corset hung loose around your body, the ribbons dangling like the reins of a horse that had not yet been mounted. Even loose, even unlaced, it changed something. Your silhouette was no longer the silhouette you had walked around in for 34 years. There was a curve where there had never been a curve. There was a suggestion of a waist, a hint of a shape, and your eyes could not look away. Elena stood behind you. She placed her hands on your shoulders and said, "Breathe." You breathed. She reached for the ribbons at the back. She began to pull, slowly, patiently, and the corset began to tighten. First, just a gentle embrace, like a hand resting on your ribs. Then firmer still. You felt the boning press against your sides. You felt your breath grow shallower, not painfully, but noticeably, and with each shortened breath something inside you seemed to sharpen, to focus, to narrow into a single burning point of awareness. She said, "This is called lacing." And every woman who has ever worn one of these knows that it is not just clothing. It is a language. It is a discipline. It is a transformation. You watched in the mirror as your waist pulled in, as your posture straightened whether you wanted it to or not, as your shoulders drew back because the corset would not allow them to slouch. You watched a stranger appear in the reflection, and yet the stranger had your face, your eyes, your trembling mouth. Elena tied the ribbons at the small of your back, a careful, deliberate bow. She turned you around again to face her. She looked at you for a long moment without speaking, and her eyes were shining, and you did not know if she was going to cry or laugh or kiss you. She said, "Do you feel it?" You could barely nod, because the corset held you so upright, so gathered, so contained that even nodding felt different. Yes, you felt it. You felt everything. She said, "This is only the beginning." And she was right, because what followed over the next weeks and months was not just a night of dressing up. It was a slow, deliberate unraveling of every layer of pretense you had ever wrapped around yourself. It was a transformation that began at the waist and worked its way outward until it reached your fingertips, your voice, your walk, your name, and eventually your soul. But that night, that first night, you did not know any of that yet. You only knew that when Elena led you to the full-length mirror and stood beside you and slipped her arm around what was now your unmistakably shaped waist, you looked at the two of you together, and something inside you cracked open, not violently, but the way an egg cracks when new life is ready to emerge. You whispered, "What is happening to me?" And Elena, wise Elena, gentle Elena, patient Elena, whispered back, "You are meeting yourself." You did not sleep that night. Elena unlaced the corset before bed, slowly, kindly, and she folded it and placed it on the chair by the window like a sleeping cat. She held you until her breathing evened out into sleep, but you lay awake staring at the ceiling, feeling the ghost of the corset still around your ribs, feeling your body remember the shape it had briefly worn. You touched your own waist in the dark, and it felt ordinary again, and something in you mourned that ordinariness. Something in you wanted the shape back. The next morning, you sat across from Elena at the breakfast table, and neither of you mentioned the night before, and yet it was in every glance, every silence, every passing of the sugar bowl. She poured your coffee and asked how you slept, and you said, "Differently." She smiled into her cup and said, "Good." Before she left for work, she paused at the door, turned, and said, "Tonight, again." It was not a question. You nodded. You spent the entire day at your desk unable to concentrate. Your colleagues asked if you were ill because you kept touching your sides absent-mindedly, feeling for something that was not there, missing it, aching for it in a way that made no logical sense. That evening she was already waiting when you came home. The corset was on the bed again, but this time there were other things beside it. A pair of dark stockings folded into a neat square. A pair of shoes with a modest heel, black, patent, gleaming. A soft slip in cream-colored silk. She said nothing. She simply gestured to the bed. You undressed without being asked. You picked up the slip first because it was closest and slid it over your head, and the silk poured down your body like cool water, and you closed your eyes because the sensation was too much and not enough at the same time. Then the stockings. She helped you with those, showing you how to gather them, how to point your toe, how to roll them up your legs without tearing them. She was patient. She was exact. She was teaching you a craft that women learn as girls and that you had never been permitted to learn. Then the corset again. This time you knew what to expect. This time you did not flinch when the boning pressed against you. This time when she began to lace, you leaned into it, and you heard her breath catch behind you, and you knew that she saw. She saw that something in you had shifted overnight. She said quietly, "You are ready to be laced tighter tonight." And you were. She pulled and pulled and pulled, and each pull was a small sentence in a story your body was learning to speak. Your waist drew in further than the night before. Your ribs remembered the pressure and welcomed it. Your breathing became a different kind of breathing, high and shallow, the kind of breathing that makes you aware of every inch of your torso. And your posture, your posture became something regal, something composed, something that no amount of masculine slouching could have ever produced. Then the shoes. The heels. You had never worn heels. She held your hand as you stepped into them. You wobbled. You almost fell. She caught you and laughed softly, not at you but with you, and she said, "Everyone falls the first time. Take small steps. Feel the ground with the ball of your foot first. Let the heel come down after. Do not fight the shoes, walk with them." You practiced. Back and forth across the bedroom carpet. Small, hesitant steps. Then slightly steadier ones. Then, after what must have been half an hour, you took your first real, natural step, and it was as if a door in your chest swung open. Elena clapped her hands together softly, delighted, and you laughed, a real laugh, a laugh you had not laughed in years, and it came from somewhere new inside you. She led you to the mirror, and now the reflection was not just a reshaped torso. Now it was a whole silhouette. The slip fell in soft folds around your legs. The stockings caught the lamplight in a subtle sheen. The corset pulled everything into an hourglass. The heels lifted you, tilted your hips, elongated your calves. You were still you. You were unmistakably you. And yet you had never seen yourself before this moment. You started to cry. You did not know why. Elena did not ask. She simply stood beside you, her hand on the small of your back, and she let you cry, and she let the mirror do its work. After a long time you wiped your eyes and looked at her and said, "Why are you doing this for me?" And she looked back at you steadily and said, "Because I love you. And because for 6 years I have watched you disappear a little more every day, and I finally understood why. And because I would rather have all of you, even the parts you thought I would never accept, than a half of you that pretends for my sake." You did not have words for that. You held her instead. You held her carefully, because the corset made it hard to bend, and she laughed into your shoulder and said, "You will learn how to hug in a corset. It is an art." And you laughed too, and the laughter mixed with the last of your tears, and something in the room shifted permanently. The weeks that followed became a rhythm. Every evening after work, she would have something new laid out on the bed. A blouse in dove gray. A skirt in deep navy that fell just below the knee. A pair of soft cotton gloves for handling delicate fabrics. A hairbrush with natural bristles. A small case of makeup, unopened, waiting. She never rushed you. She never pushed you past what you were ready for. She let each piece arrive in its own time. The corset remained the center of everything. It was the anchor. It was the daily ritual. Every evening you would strip down and stand in front of her and lift your arms, and she would slip it over you and begin the lacing. It became a meditation. The way monks return to their prayers, you returned to the ribbons. And every night she laced you a little tighter, and every night your body accepted a little more of the shape it seemed to have been secretly waiting for. Your natural waist had been an ordinary waist, thick from years of desk work and beer on weekends. But under the discipline of the corset, week by week, it began to change. Not just when you wore it, but even when you did not. Your muscles were being trained. Your ribs were being taut. Your posture was being rebuilt. When you undressed at night, you could see the faint impression of the boning on your skin, like a signature the corset was leaving on your flesh, saying, "I was here, I am shaping you." You began to notice yourself differently in mirrors. In the reflective glass of shop windows on your way to work. In the mirror above the bathroom sink. In the black screen of your phone when it was turned off. You noticed how you held yourself. How your shoulders no longer slumped. How your walk had changed. Even in your ordinary work clothes, in your ordinary suit and tie, there was something new in the way you moved that other people were beginning to notice too. Your assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Priya, said to you one afternoon over coffee, "You seem different lately. Lighter somehow." You laughed nervously and said, "New exercise routine." She smiled a smile that suggested she did not believe you and did not need to. She said, "Whatever it is, keep doing it. It suits you." You went home that night and told Elena, and Elena said, "Of course. The body knows. The body always tells the truth even when the mouth is still lying." One evening, she brought home a wig. A soft, wavy wig in a warm chestnut color, cut just below the shoulders. She placed it on a stand on the dresser and said, "Whenever you are ready." You looked at it for 3 nights in a row before you touched it. On the 4th night, you asked her to help you put it on. She stood behind you at the mirror. She gathered your own hair back and pinned it flat. She slid the wig over your head and adjusted it carefully, a fraction of an inch this way, a fraction that way, until it sat perfectly. Then she stepped back. And you did not recognize yourself. Not at all. Not even a little. The face in the mirror was still yours, of course. The eyes, the nose, the mouth. But framed by that soft chestnut hair, everything looked different. Your jaw looked softer. Your cheeks looked fuller. Your eyes looked larger. It was as if a curtain had been pulled back on a version of yourself that had been standing behind you your entire life, waiting patiently for you to turn around. You reached up and touched the hair. It felt strange, and then it felt right. You turned your head slowly from side to side and watched the hair move with you. Elena said, "Do you want to see her all together?" And your heart lurched at the word she used. Her. Not him. Not you. Her. You said yes. Elena guided you through the rest of the outfit. The stockings, the slip, the corset laced with quiet expertise, the skirt, a soft cream blouse with delicate buttons at the cuffs, a thin gold necklace that had belonged to her grandmother, and finally, the shoes. You stood in front of the mirror in full for the first time, and the person looking back at you was not a costume, was not a joke, was not a fantasy, was a person, was someone who had a face and a name and a life waiting to be lived. Elena said, "Do you know what you want to be called? When you are her." You had not thought about it. Or rather, you had thought about it 1,000 times over the course of your life, in the private darkness of falling asleep, in the anonymity of long walks, but you had never spoken any name aloud. You had never dared. Names have power. Names make things real. You looked at your reflection. You looked at her. And you heard yourself say, softly, almost a whisper, "Vivian." Elena repeated it. "Vivian." She said it slowly, as if tasting it, and then she nodded and said, "Yes. That is exactly her name." You cried again. You had cried more in these last weeks than you had cried in the previous 20 years combined. Elena passed you a tissue and warned you to dab, not wipe, because she had lightly touched some color to your eyelashes, and you did not want to smudge it. You laughed through the tears at that, and she laughed too, and Vivian laughed with you both, and the 3 of you, if you can imagine such a thing, stood in that bedroom together and felt whole. But transformation is not only tenderness. Transformation is also fear. Transformation is the trembling that comes with being seen. And you were still, at that point, only being seen within 4 walls. The corset came off every night. The wig went back on its stand. The skirt returned to its hanger. And the next morning you put on your suit and tie and went to work as the man you had always been, and every day that man felt a little bit more like a costume and a little bit less like a self. The tension began to grow. Because Vivian was becoming real, and the man in the suit was becoming a rehearsal. And you started to wonder, as everyone in your position eventually wonders, how long can you live in two shapes? How long can you go home in one body and leave the house in another? How long can you carry a secret that is not shameful, only tender, only true, only yours, but that the world is not always kind about? The first real test came unexpectedly. It was a Saturday afternoon, one of those bright, cool days at the end of autumn when the light comes through the windows in long golden slices. Elena said, "Let's go out." You froze. She said, "Not far. Just to the little cafe on Elm Street. Just for coffee." You said, "Dressed." And she nodded. She said, "Dressed." Your heart began to hammer so hard against the corset you were already wearing that you thought the boning would crack. You said, "I cannot. I cannot. What if someone recognizes me? What if someone stares? What if someone laughs?" She sat you down on the edge of the bed and took your hands in hers and said, "Listen to me. Someone might stare. Someone might laugh. Someone might not even notice. You cannot control what strangers do. You can only control who you are when you walk out that door. And who you are today is Vivian. And Vivian deserves a coffee." You looked at yourself in the mirror. Elena had done your makeup, more carefully than usual. A soft foundation, a hint of blush, a warm rosy color on your lips, the same subtle touch on your eyelashes. She had chosen a longer skirt for you, one that fell to the ankle, and a soft wool cardigan in deep plum, and low-heeled boots that would be easier to walk in. She had brushed the wig out until it shone. Around your neck, she had placed a soft silk scarf, cream and green, tied loosely. You looked at yourself and thought, I could be anyone. I could be someone's aunt. I could be someone's friend. I could be the woman across the aisle on the bus. I could be a person walking through the world without anyone thinking twice. And you thought more quietly, please let that be true. She held out her hand. You took it. You walked to the front door. You stopped with your hand on the knob. Elena said, "Whenever you are ready." There is no rush. And you took 3 deep breaths, 3 careful breaths against the corset, and you opened the door, and you stepped out. The world did not stop. The sky did not fall. The neighbor across the street, watering her plants, glanced up and smiled, and went back to her watering. The postman waved from 3 doors down. A car passed. A bird called from the roof. The world, it turned out, was extraordinarily uninterested in your revolution. You almost laughed. You almost cried again. You did neither. You walked. Elena walked beside you. Not too close, not too far. Just there. You walked to the cafe, and every step was an entire lifetime. You felt the heels tap on the pavement. You felt the skirt brush against your calves. You felt the cool autumn air on your neck where it had never been before. You felt the wind lift the ends of your hair. You felt like glass. You felt like you might shatter at any moment. And you kept walking. At the cafe, the bell above the door rang as you entered. A young woman at the counter greeted you both with a bright, indifferent smile. She asked what you would like. Elena ordered her usual. Then the woman turned to you and said, "And for you, ma'am."
Ma'am, ma'am.
That one syllable, that ordinary syllable, hit you like a wave. You almost forgot how to speak. You cleared your throat, and you kept it soft, careful, gentle, the way Elena had been quietly teaching you, and you said, "A chamomile tea, please." And the woman nodded and turned to make it. And that was it. That was the whole event. There was no drama. There was no discovery. There was no ruin. You sat at a small table by the window. Elena took your hand across the table. You could not stop smiling. You could not stop trembling either. Your tea arrived, steaming and pale gold, and you lifted the cup with a hand that shook slightly, and you took a sip, and Elena said, "Welcome to the world, Vivian." And Vivian answered her. Vivian said, "Thank you." That night when you returned home, you did not want to unlace. You did not want the corset off. You did not want the skirt off. You did not want the day to end. Elena understood. She let you keep everything on until bedtime. You sat together on the sofa watching an old film neither of you were really watching, and every so often you looked down at your own lap, at the fall of the fabric, at the shape of your legs in stockings, and you thought, this is real. This is real. This is really real. But real things have consequences. Real things ripple outward. And soon enough the ripples reached the shore. Your sister called the following week. Marta was 2 years older than you, sharp and warm and impossibly perceptive. She had always known when something was different with you, from the time you were children. She said, "Are you free this weekend? I want to visit." And you panicked. You told Elena immediately. Elena said, "What do you want to do?" And you said, "I do not know. I do not know. I do not know." Elena said you have 3 choices. You can put everything away for the weekend and be who you have always been for her. You can leave everything as it is and let her see whatever she sees. Or you can tell her before she comes. Those are your 3 choices, and only you can make it. You did not sleep that night. You lay in the dark with your fingers pressed against your ribs, feeling for the ghost of the corset. You imagined Marta's face. Warm Marta. Sharp Marta. The sister who had covered for you 100 times when you were teenagers. The sister who had told you at your wedding that Elena was the best thing that had ever happened to you. The sister who had once, when you were 8 and she was 10, caught you trying on her Sunday dress and had simply said, "That color suits you," and never mentioned it again, not once, not ever, until now, when the memory came back to you like a hand reaching through time. In the morning you called her. You said, "Before you come, there is something I want to tell you." And she said, in a voice so gentle it broke you, "I think I already know. I think I have known since we were children."
Tell me anyway.
And tell me her name. You said her name.
Vivian.
And Marta said it back to you, and then she cried and you cried, and Elena stood in the doorway of the kitchen with her hand pressed to her mouth, and the whole house felt like it was being rebuilt around you with new load-bearing walls. Marta came that weekend. She brought a small gift wrapped in silver paper. When you opened it, it was a pair of earrings, delicate silver drops with tiny pearls. She said, "They were our grandmother's. She would have wanted them to belong to someone who would love them." And you sat on the couch in your everyday clothes, in your suit and tie identity, holding those earrings in your palm, and you understood for the first time that this transformation was not only about clothing, was not only about the corset, was not only about the mirror. It was about lineage. It was about being seen not just by strangers, but by the people who had known you the longest. It was about being welcomed home into a family that turned out to have been waiting for you all along. Marta asked, "May I meet her?" And Elena took you upstairs and she helped you dress, and it took an hour because your hands were shaking so much she had to do the lacing 3 times. And when you came back down the stairs, Marta was standing at the bottom with tears already streaming down her face, and she said, "Oh, look at you, look at you, look at you." And she put her arms around you and held you, and you wore the earrings, and the earrings caught the afternoon light, and you all sat and drank tea for hours and talked about nothing important, and everything was different, and everything was, for the first time in your entire life, whole. But the world beyond your sister was not always your sister. The world had strangers in it. The world had your parents in it. The world had your colleagues in it. The world had the neighbor who waved and the neighbor who did not. And you were beginning to understand that transformation is not a single door you walk through. It is a long hallway with many doors, some of which open easily, some of which are locked, some of which you have to knock on for years before anyone answers. The corset stayed at the center. Every evening, every ritual, every quiet moment, Elena would help you lace, and each lacing became a kind of prayer, a kind of promise, a kind of tightening of your commitment to the truth of yourself. Your waist had reshaped further. Your posture had settled into something graceful. Your movements, even out of the corset, had changed. You noticed one morning that even in your work suit, walking to your car, you were placing one foot in front of the other in a way that men did not usually walk. You had absorbed the corset. You were carrying it inside you now, even when you were not wearing it. At work, things became complicated. Priya, your sharp-eyed assistant, cornered you in the break room one afternoon and said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to know that whatever you say, I am on your side." She lowered her voice. She said, "Are you transitioning? Are you her?" You froze. You stared at the coffee machine as if it might rescue you. Then you looked at her, and you saw only kindness in her face, only patience, and you heard yourself say, in a voice you almost did not recognize as your own, "I do not know yet what I am. But something is changing." Yes. Priya nodded slowly. She said, "Thank you for telling me." She said, "When you are ready, if you are ever ready, I will help you. I will help you talk to HR. I will help you talk to the team. I will help you with whatever comes next. And in the meantime, she said with a small smile, you have been walking around here with better posture than anyone in this building, and I want you to know that I have noticed and I am proud of you, whoever you turn out to be. You went into the bathroom after that conversation and locked yourself in a stall and cried silently for 10 minutes. Not from fear. From something bigger than fear. From the strange and terrible relief of being seen in the middle of a place where you had spent years being invisible. That night you told Elena. She said, the world is not as cruel as the movies say. Sometimes people surprise you. Sometimes people are waiting for permission to be kind. And she laced you tighter than she had ever laced you. And you gasped, and she said, breathe into it. Vivian, breathe into it. And you did. And it held you. And you held yourself. Your parents were the hardest. Your father was a man who believed in shapes. Shapes of men. Shapes of women. Shapes of family. Shapes of proper behavior. Your mother was gentler, but her gentleness had always been afraid of upsetting your father. You had spent your entire life managing them. You had spent your entire life being what they expected. And you were beginning to understand that you could not sustain that anymore. Not because you had stopped loving them, but because loving them at the cost of yourself was a bargain you had made as a child, and children make bargains that adults must sometimes renegotiate. Elena said, take your time. Marta will help. And Marta did. She spoke to your mother first, alone, over coffee, and reported back that your mother had cried, but not in the way you feared. Your mother had said, I always felt like I had a daughter and a son, and I could never explain why. Your father was more difficult. He did not want to hear it. He walked out of the room the first time.
He walked out the second time.
He came back the third time. The third time he sat across from you at his kitchen table, and he did not look at you, and he said, I do not understand this. I do not know what to do with this. But you are my child. And Marta says you are still my child. And your mother says you are still my child. And your wife, apparently, seems very sure. So, I am going to try. That is the best I can offer you right now. I am going to try. You said, that is enough. That is more than enough.
Thank you.
He looked up at you then, briefly, for just a second, and his eyes were red. And you knew that in his own way, in his stiff, halting, awkward way, he was reaching across a great distance to hold your hand. And you reached back. Not all of the doors opened. Some old friends drifted away, without saying why. A distant cousin sent a letter that Elena tore up before you could read it. Your boss at work, when you finally sat down with him and told him everything, listened with a professional stillness and then said, I need to think about this. He came back 2 days later and said, we'll make it work. He said, you have done good work here, for 8 years. That work does not change. What you wear does not change that. And you thought, in that moment, that perhaps the world was not the fortress you had always imagined it to be. Perhaps the world was more like an old house with many windows, and some of the windows were stuck, and some opened easily if you only knew where to push. The first day you went to work as Vivian was the day the sky was so gray, it looked like the inside of a bell. Elena drove you. You sat in the passenger seat in a simple navy skirt suit, cream blouse, low heels, minimal makeup, the pearl earrings your sister had given you, and a small silver watch on your wrist. The corset was under everything, of course. It had become part of you. You almost never went a day without it now. It was your armor. It was your architecture. It was your prayer. You stepped out of the car in the parking lot. Elena squeezed your hand and said, I will be here at 5. And she drove away. And you stood there in the parking lot alone for a full minute before you could make yourself walk toward the door. Priya was waiting for you in the lobby. She had brought you a small bunch of flowers, 3 white roses tied with a green ribbon. She said, welcome, and she said your name, your real name, Vivian, and she took your arm and walked you inside, and the whole day was terrifying and ordinary at once, and by the end of it you were exhausted in a way that felt cleaner than any exhaustion you had ever known. Some colleagues stared. Some colleagues avoided you. Some colleagues smiled warmly. One older woman from accounting, a stern woman you had barely ever spoken to in 8 years, stopped you in the hallway and said, my niece transitioned 3 years ago. I did not always understand it. I understand it a little more every day. Welcome. And she walked on before you could respond. And you stood there in the hallway holding your files against your chest, blinking hard, wondering how many people carry these quiet solidarities under their ordinary faces. You went home that night and Elena unlaced you slowly and asked, "How are you?" And you thought about it for a long time. You looked at yourself in the mirror as she loosened the ribbons, as the pressure on your ribs eased, as your breath deepened, and you said, "I am tired. I am scared. I am proud. I am here. All at once. I am here." The months that followed were not linear. Transformation is never linear. There were good days and hard days. Days when strangers on the street said something cruel and days when strangers on the street smiled at you as if you were nothing more remarkable than the sunrise. There were days when the corset felt like a second skin and days when you took it off and looked at the marks it had left on your body and cried for reasons even you could not fully name. There were medical questions to consider, questions you had never dared to ask yourself, questions Elena raised gently, patiently, always leaving the answers up to you. There were doctors' offices with kind receptionists and doctors' offices with cold ones. There were forms to fill out where the boxes did not fit you and forms where they did. There were long conversations about the future, about identity, about what Vivian wanted, about what you could imagine, about what you were ready for, and what you were not. Through it all, the corset remained. It had started as a piece of clothing. It had become a discipline. And now it was something else, something almost hard to name. A cornerstone, a witness, a friend. Every evening the same ritual. Arms up, cool satin, firm ribbons, steady breath. Each night Elena spoke a little less as she laced, because she did not need to speak, because your body knew the ritual as well as she did, because the two of you had built a language out of breath and pressure and silk. One evening, about a year into all of this, you were standing in front of the mirror after Elena had finished lacing you. You were dressed for a small dinner party at a friend's house, a friend of Marta's who had heard your story and had insisted on inviting you. You wore a deep emerald dress with sleeves that fell just past your elbows. The corset shaped you beneath it. Your hair, your own hair now, grown out to your shoulders, was pinned up with a small silver clip. The pearl earrings your sister had given you gleamed softly. You looked at yourself, really looked, and for the first time you did not see the man you used to be trying on someone else's life. You saw yourself. Only yourself.
Vivian.
Whole, imperfect, real. Elena came up behind you and rested her chin on your shoulder. She said, "Do you remember the first night? Do you remember how frightened you were?" You said, "I remember thinking I was going to disappear." She said, "And instead." And you said, "And instead I appeared." She smiled into your shoulder. She said, "That is the whole story, isn't it? That is what a corset is really for. Not to squeeze you into someone else's shape, but to hold you tight enough that you finally emerge as your own." You leaned back against her. You closed your eyes. You breathed as deeply as the corset allowed, which was not very deep, but it was enough. It was always enough. Every breath in that garment was smaller than a normal breath, but somehow richer, somehow fuller, somehow more. You thought about the woman who had walked into that cafe on Elm Street a year ago, trembling, sure she was about to be destroyed. You thought about the young girl inside you at 14 who had stood in a guest room in her cousin's blouse and stared at the mirror in terror and wonder. You thought about your father's red eyes across the kitchen table. You thought about Priya and the 3 white roses. You thought about your mother saying, "I always felt like I had a daughter and a son." You thought about all the small and large kindnesses that had carried you here. You opened your eyes. You looked at yourself one more time. You said out loud to the mirror, "Hello, Vivian. I am glad you are here." And then you and Elena went to the dinner party, and the world kept turning, and life continued, ordinary and extraordinary, the way lives do. There is a temptation, when telling a story like this, to end at the triumphant moment, to close the curtain on the woman in the emerald dress and let the audience carry that image home. But real life does not end at the moment of triumph. Real life continues on both sides of the mirror. And so you should know that there were harder days ahead too. Days when someone shouted something ugly at you from a passing car, and you had to sit in your parked vehicle for 20 minutes before you could drive home. Days when you doubted everything, When you looked at yourself and thought, who am I really? And no answer came. Days when Elena was tired, when she had her own struggles, when the weight of being your first and steadiest witness became heavy even for her, and the two of you had to renegotiate, again, the shape of your marriage inside this new life. There were friends who had said they would stay, and drifted away anyway. There were friends who you never expected who arrived without being asked and stayed forever. There was a woman at a bus stop one afternoon who reached out to touch your hair without permission, and you flinched, and she said, "Oh, I am sorry. You just look so lovely," and you did not know whether to be angry or moved. There was a little girl in a park who tugged on her mother's sleeve and pointed at you and said, "Mama, is that lady a princess?" And her mother, without missing a beat, said, "Yes, she is." And the little girl waved at you, and you waved back, and you cried the entire way home. Cried and laughed and cried again. There was the first time you went to the beach with your body newly your own, wearing a modest swimsuit and a wide-brimmed hat, terrified of every glance, and instead of a horror you expected, you had one perfectly ordinary afternoon in the sun, and you came home slightly sunburned, and Elena laughed and rubbed lotion on your shoulders and said, "My little tomato," and you understood that there was such a thing as an ordinary Tuesday now, and that ordinariness had become the most precious luxury of your entire life. There was the moment, not long after that, when your father came to visit and stayed for a whole weekend, and he did not say much, he never said much, but on the last morning as he was leaving he stood on the porch and looked at you in your simple weekend clothes, hair down, no makeup, corset laced beneath your soft cotton sweater, and he said, gruffly, awkwardly, without meeting your eyes, "You look well. You look well." And he got in his car and drove away. And Elena had to hold you up on the porch because your legs would not hold you anymore. Because you had waited your entire life to hear a sentence like that from him, and it was so small, and it was so enormous, and it undid you. There were quiet mornings when you woke up beside Elena and looked at the ceiling and thought, "I am not sure I ever fully believed this would happen. I am not sure I ever fully believed I would live inside my own body. And I am here. And I am here. And I am here." You began to keep a journal. You wrote in it every night after Elena had unlaced you and you had climbed into bed. You wrote about the small things. The sound of your heels on the pavement. The scent of the lavender candle Elena still lit on important nights. The particular ache of the boning against your ribs by the end of a long day, an ache that had become a kind of home. You wrote about your fears and your joys and the strange, quiet gratitude that had begun to settle in you, low and steady, like a coal fire. One night you wrote, "The corset did not change me. It revealed me. It held me until I could hold myself. And when I no longer needed it to hold me, it stayed anyway because I loved it, because it was mine, because it had witnessed every step of the road I walked." You closed the journal and set it on the nightstand. You looked over at Elena, already half asleep, her hair spread out on the pillow. You thought about the very first night, about her sitting on the edge of the bed with the corset folded in her lap, about the terrifying moment when she had said, "Tonight it is your turn." You had not known then that a piece of clothing could rearrange your entire life. You had not known that a woman could love you enough to hand you a mirror in the shape of a garment and say, "Look, look, look, this is who you are, do not be afraid." You had not known that your own body was carrying an entire other person inside it, waiting patiently, undemanding, only hoping. You had not known any of it. And now you knew all of it. You reached out in the dark and took Elena's hand. She stirred, and she smiled with her eyes still closed, and she murmured your name. Not the name you were born with, the name you had chosen, the name that was yours.
Vivian.
She said it like a prayer, like a promise, like a fact. You closed your eyes. You listened to her breathing. You listened to your own. You listened to the small settling sounds of the house, the sounds a home makes when it has learned to hold new people inside its old walls. You thought about the woman you would be tomorrow, and the day after, and the year after that. You thought about all the mirrors you would still stand in front of, all the small rituals still to come, all the corsets and slips and stockings, but also all the ordinary things, the grocery lists, the doctor's appointments, the birthdays, the arguments, the reconciliations, the whole long, strange, beautiful road of a life that had finally begun to belong to you. You thought about the 14-year-old in the guest room, and you spoke to her silently across the years, and you said, "We made it. We are here. You are safe now. You're seen. You're whole." You drifted toward sleep. In the last flickering moments before you slipped under, you touched your own waist through the blanket, out of habit, out of memory, out of tenderness. You felt the ordinary softness of your body. You felt the ghost of the corset, which was always with you now, whether you wore it or not. You felt the shape of who you had become. And in that final quiet moment before sleep took you, you smiled, and you thought, one last time, before letting the day close, my wife forced me into her corset, and in doing so, she freed me. She did not tie me down. She laced me together. She held me at the waist until I could stand on my own. She gave me the shape I had always been searching for, the shape that had always been mine, the shape that was waiting inside me all along. And you slept. And you dreamed. And when you woke in the morning, the corset was on its chair by the window, patient as always, waiting like a friend who never tires of you, and Elena was in the kitchen humming some song you did not recognize, and the light was coming in through the curtains in long golden slices, and it was, at last, at last, at last, a perfectly ordinary morning in your perfectly extraordinary life. You got out of bed. You walked to the window. You looked out at the street where you had once been terrified to step even for a single block. You saw a neighbor walking her dog. You saw a child heading to school with a red backpack. You saw the world in motion, ordinary and enormous, and you understood that you belonged to it now, not as a visitor, not as a rehearsal, not as a secret, but as a person, as a woman, as Vivian. You turned from the window. You picked up the corset from its chair. You held it in your hands for a moment. You felt the satin and the boning and the long, patient ribbons. And you smiled. And you called out to your wife. And you said, "Will you help me lace up? It is going to be a good day." And Elena's voice came back from the kitchen, warm as sunlight, sure as a heartbeat. She said, "Of course, my love. I have been waiting all morning." And that was how it began. And that was how it continued. And that, in some deep and permanent way, is how it will always be. Because a corset is a strange thing. It is fabric and thread and boning. It is history and shape and pressure. It is discipline and beauty and tradition. But most of all, when it is given by the right hands at the right moment, in the right spirit, a corset is a promise. A promise that you will be held. A promise that you will be shaped. A promise that you will be seen. A promise that even in the tightest embrace, there is room to breathe, and there is room to grow, and there is room to become the person you were always, always, always meant to be. And you were, and you are, and you always will be, Vivian.